It is with great pleasure that my wife and I welcome you to Windsor Castle on this, your second state visit to the United Kingdom. This relationship, which, with good reason...
There is a river in the high desert of Central Oregon that, not so long ago, looked less like a river and more like an open wound in the earth. Bridge Creek, a 45-kilometer tributary of the John Day River, had been carved into a narrow, sunken trench. Its banks were stripped bare. Its waters ran thin, fast, and dangerously warm in the summer heat. The fish that once thrived there endangered steelhead, a type of rainbow trout that migrates to the ocean and back, were barely hanging on. The ecosystem had not simply declined. It had, in the language of ecologists, collapsed. Bridge Creek devolved into a narrow trench bordered by desiccated pastures. It was kind of a godforsaken place, said Michael Pollock, an ecosystems analyst with NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, Washington. Yet even in that degraded state, the creek was not entirely without life. A small, struggling population of steelhead still moved through its waters, and scattered along its banks, a remnant colony of beavers was making a valiant, largely futile effort to do what beavers have done for millions of years: build dams and reshape the landscape around them. The problem was that the beavers were losing, and understanding why they were losing is essential to understanding what came next. To truly grasp what happened at Bridge Creek, you have to understand the history of destruction that preceded the restoration. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. It happened because of a deliberate campaign of ecological warfare waged nearly 2 centuries ago. In the 1820s, UK operatives deliberately exterminated the region's beavers to dissuade U.S. trappers from invading the Oregon Territory, which was claimed at the time by both the United Kingdom and the United States. The gambit failed, but the beavers' destruction, combined with unchecked cattle grazing, left an enduring legacy. Generations of livestock trampled the vegetation, holding the riverbanks together. Without roots to anchor the soil, and without beavers to slow the water, the creek began to cut downward, year after year, carving deeper into the ground in a process scientists call channel incision. In a healthy, beaver-rich creek, dams slow water flows, capture sediment, and counteract erosion. But after beavers and their speed bumps disappeared, streams eroded into their beds, cutting deep gullies in a process called incision. These steep-sided, straight-jacketed streams lost the ability to spill onto their floodplains and recharge aquifers. Some groundwater-fed streams dried up altogether. Bridge Creek, by the time researchers began paying serious attention to it in the early 2000s, was a textbook example of this kind of collapse. Much of Bridge Creek suffered from channel incision and featured an overall lack of habitat complexity, hydrologic disconnection from groundwater and its floodplain, and high stream temperatures thought to be detrimental to juvenile steelhead. The few beavers that remained were caught in a frustrating loop. They would build dams across the narrow, incised channel, but those dams sat at the bottom of a steep trench, bearing the full force of floodwaters with no floodplain to dissipate the energy. Most beaver dams were constructed within the incision trench and during high discharge events. The full force of floodwaters was concentrated on these dams rather than dissipating across floodplains. Consequently, most dams breached and failed within their first season. The beavers were not failing because they lacked skill. They were failing because the very conditions that beavers are supposed to fix had deteriorated beyond the point where beavers alone could fix them. This is the paradox at the heart of degraded river ecosystems. The animal most capable of healing them is often the one least able to survive in them. Michael Pollock had spent years studying the relationship between beavers and salmon in Alaska before turning his attention to Oregon. He had come to believe, through careful observation, that even short-lived, imperfect beaver dams could trap meaningful quantities of sediment and begin the slow work of raising a riverbed. He suspected that, if given a chance, the rodents could capture enough sediment to elevate Bridge Creek's bed, reconnect it with the floodplain, and inundate side channels and backwaters in which juvenile steelhead could thrive. The solution he and his colleagues devised was elegantly simple and, at first glance, almost embarrassingly low-tech. They would build fake beaver dams, not concrete weirs, not engineered rock structures requiring heavy machinery and million-dollar budgets. Fake beaver dams, rows of wooden posts hammered into the stream with willow branches woven between them, and rocks and mud piled on the upstream side to help trap sediment. These structures, formerly called beaver dam analogs, or BDAs, were not meant to do the river's healing themselves. They were meant to give the beavers already living in Bridge Creek a fighting chance. The biodegradable posts were intended to buy enough time for beaver to occupy the structures and build on or maintain the structures as their own dams, and for aggradation in the slack waters of the pond from the dam to take place and promote reconnection with the floodplain. The treatment involves installing round wooden fence posts across potential floodplain surfaces and the channel, approximately 0.5 to 1 meter apart and at a height intended to act as the crest elevation of an active beaver dam. 5 variants of the restoration treatment were used: post lines only, post lines with wicker weaves, construction of starter dams, reinforcement of existing active beaver dams, and reinforcement of abandoned beaver dams. Bridge Creek became an intensively monitored watershed in 2007, and restoration treatments were implemented in 2009. That year, the pair used their new approach to build 76 BDAs, fashioned from upright posts with willow branches woven between them on 3.4 kilometers of Bridge Creek. They added more in subsequent years. The budget was astonishingly modest. Installation of a BDA takes 3 people approximately 1 to 4 hours, requires a hydraulic post driver and 20 to 40 wood posts at approximately $4 per post. The cost at a density of roughly 30 BDAs per kilometer is less than $11,000. In contrast, conventional restoration techniques often involve massive grading operations with heavy equipment and major revegetation efforts that are extremely expensive and uncertain. To many conventional salmon biologists watching from the sidelines, the experiment looked like wishful thinking. To many salmon biologists, the experiment seemed the height of insanity. The dams, they warned, would bury key habitat in silt and expose still waters to the sun, making ponds too hot for young fish. The critics were not wrong to be cautious. The stakes were real. Bridge Creek hosted a population of federally endangered steelhead, and if the BDAs made conditions worse instead of better, the consequences could be severe. There was also the underlying uncertainty. Would the beavers even cooperate? They cooperated. Almost immediately, and with a thoroughness that astonished even the researchers who had designed the experiment. Wherever we put structures, beavers came and set up shop, recalled Nick Weber, the project's coordinator based in Bend, Oregon. The artificial dams gave the beavers something they had never had before in Bridge Creek's degraded state, a foundation stable enough to build on and maintain. Instead of watching their hard work wash away in the first winter flood, the beavers found structures that survived the high flows, and they began reinforcing and expanding them with their own materials. By 2013, beavers had fortified nearly 60 BDAs and built 115 new dams. All told, Bridge Creek's beaver activity increased eightfold. What had been a river with a handful of short-lived, struggling dams became something altogether different, a dynamic, spreading, beaver-engineered wetland system where before there had been nothing but a bare, incised ditch. The mechanism behind this cascade of change is worth understanding in detail, because it is not simply a matter of dams blocking water. Each dam that held each structure that survived a winter without washing away did something profound. It slowed the water moving through the channel, forcing it to drop the sediment it was carrying. That sediment accumulated behind each dam, slowly but steadily raising the bed of the stream. As the stream rose, water that had previously been locked inside a deep trench began to rise closer to the surrounding land surface. Beaver dams anchored to the BDAs raised the water level, creating large pools where sediment was deposited. Soon the trenches began filling in, and water spread out onto the adjacent floodplain, giving rise to streamside vegetation and creating side channels and backwaters. This, along with increased surface water elevations from the dams, allowed water to dissipate onto floodplains during high water, which created more channels and wetted surfaces that allowed for more vegetation like willow to grow. The increased water elevations also increased the height of the water table. Researchers also found cold upwellings below beaver dams, which had a cooling effect in reaches with beaver dams. This last point deserves emphasis. Water temperature is not a minor detail in the world of salmon and steelhead recovery. It is often the defining constraint. Steelhead are cold water fish, and water that is too warm in summer can kill juvenile fish outright or stress them so severely that they cannot grow or survive predation. One of the most serious charges leveled against the beta experiment was that standing water in ponds would overheat in the desert sun. Instead, the opposite happened. The rising water table created pathways for cool groundwater to enter the stream from below, producing the cold upwellings that researchers measured downstream of the dams. The thermal crisis that critics predicted never materialized. The scientific team monitoring Bridge Creek was not simply watching the physical landscape change. They were tracking the fish intensively, rigorously, at a scale that few restoration experiments have ever attempted. Over 7 years, the scientists tagged 35,867 fish with tiny electronic tags to track their movements and survival. This was not a casual before and after comparison. It was a controlled, watershed-scale experiment with treatment areas, control areas, and reference areas, designed to isolate the effects of the BDAs from other factors. The results were unambiguous. Only 4 years after scientists first installed the BDAs in Bridge Creek, they recorded a 175% increase in juvenile steelhead production compared to the control watershed. The fish were not simply surviving better. They were using entirely new habitat, the ponds, side channels, and backwaters that the beaver-engineered landscape had created, where previously there had been nothing but bare gravel and sun-baked banks. Fish densities were higher in pool environments. Juvenile survival rates increased by 52% compared to controls lacking BDAs, and production of juvenile steelheads rose by approximately 175% over the 4 years following installation of the BDE structures, resulting in overall higher net production of steelhead trout. The speed of that transformation was what stunned the researchers most. Habitat changes that we thought would take a decade happened in 1 to 3 years, said lead researcher Nick Bowis. And as the habitat grew in complexity, the fish population tracked right alongside it. What was most surprising was how fast we saw changes and how fast the fish responded, said Chris Jordan, a fisheries ecologist with NOAA Fisheries Northwest Fisheries Science Center and co-author of the research. Bridge Creek produced nearly 3 times more fish than a nearby control stream, and its young steelhead were 52% more likely to survive, the researchers reported in 2016 in Scientific Reports. The creek's submerged area didn't just expand modestly, the creek's submerged area tripled, and side channels grew by more than 1,200%. A river that had been a simple, scoured, single-channel trench had become an intricate, braided, multi-threaded ecosystem. The beavers had, in a handful of years, accomplished what river engineers with bulldozers and millions of dollars had struggled to replicate elsewhere, and they had done it by simply doing what beavers do. We went from a place where the beavers couldn't even manage to build dams to a place where the beavers control the landscape, Jordan said. We got it started, but the beavers did the work. It would be tempting to treat Bridge Creek as a heartwarming local success story and leave it there. But the implications of what happened on that 45-kilometer stretch of Oregon high desert ripple far beyond the John Day River Basin. The study is the first large-scale experiment to quantify the benefits of beavers and BDAs to a fish population and its habitat. Beaver-mediated restoration may be a viable and efficient strategy to recover ecosystem function of previously incised streams and to increase the production of threatened fish populations. The reason this matters so urgently is that Bridge Creek is not an anomaly. Across the American West, across Europe, across much of the world, wherever rivers were straightened, streams were grazed down to bare dirt, and beavers were trapped to near extinction, you find the same syndrome. incised channels, disconnected floodplains, vanishing wetlands, failing fish populations. The problems Bridge Creek faced are repeated in thousands of watersheds, and the conventional solutions, massive grading, concrete structures, engineered weirs, are often prohibitively expensive, ecologically disruptive, and uncertain in their long-term outcomes. The results suggest that under the right conditions, beavers can restore the health of streams and their fish faster and likely at lower cost than traditional river restoration that relies on expensive heavy equipment. The cost differential alone is staggering. A single bidet costs roughly $80 to $160 in materials and a few hours of labor. Conventional stream restoration projects using heavy equipment can run to tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per kilometer, and they require ongoing maintenance. At Bridge Creek, once the BDAs gave the beavers a foothold, the beavers themselves maintained and expanded the system, no further human intervention required. The animals became the restoration infrastructure. Funding agencies that support restoration work have begun to grant financial support to BDA projects, citing results from the ongoing Bridge Creek research. Some ranchers are interested in the ability of BDAs to restore incised streams and prolong stream flow, and are starting to use BDAs to improve the health of riparian areas. The Bridge Creek experiment also challenged something deeper than just conventional restoration engineering. It challenged the assumption common among wildlife managers for most of the 20th century that degraded ecosystems must be rebuilt from the outside in by humans imposing structure on a broken landscape. What Bridge Creek demonstrated was the opposite, that the ecosystem contained within itself the capacity for self-repair if you could just give it a small enough nudge to get started. The beavers were always there. The biological knowledge of how to rebuild a river was encoded in their instincts passed down through countless generations. What they lacked was a stable foundation to work from. The BDAs provided that foundation, nothing more, nothing less, and the rest happened on its own. The Bridge Creek story is not without its complications. Researchers have been careful to note that BDAs are not a universal solution. In Bridge Creek, Oregon, rates of structure occupancy were not reported, but there was a documented 800% increase in the number of dams following BDA installation. But at other sites where BDAs have been tried, the results have been more mixed. And scientists continue to investigate why some sites respond dramatically while others do not. Channel incision is a global problem and has resulted in simplified streams, a loss of floodplain vegetation, and poor fish habitat. Natural recovery of an incised channel to its floodplain can take centuries. Restoration approaches to restore incised streams are extremely expensive and highly uncertain. BDAs, the Bridge Creek researchers are careful to say, work best where a population of beavers already exists and where the underlying conditions, the right stream gradient, the right hydrology, the right availability of food and dam building materials are in place. They are not a plug-and-play solution for every degraded waterway on Earth, but in the right setting, the results can be almost miraculous in their speed and scope. The monitoring at Bridge Creek also continues, and researchers are still untangling the full range of ecological benefits beyond steelhead. Riparian vegetation has expanded along the restored reaches. Songbirds and waterfowl have returned to areas that were previously bare and degraded. The water table has risen in adjacent areas, changing the hydrology of the surrounding landscape in ways that are still being studied. What is clear beyond any scientific doubt is that the beavers of Bridge Creek were not passive recipients of human charity. They were active, essential, irreplaceable partners in the restoration of a broken ecosystem. The researchers provided the initial scaffolding. The beavers did everything else. They built, reinforced, expanded, and maintained a network of dams that transformed a dying river into a thriving one. They did it on their own schedule, in their own way, and at a pace that no one predicted. In 2009, a small crew drove wooden posts into the bed of a dying river in the Oregon high desert and wove willow branches between them. They built 76 structures by hand. They got sore backs and muddy boots. And then they stepped back. What followed was one of the most remarkable ecological recoveries ever documented in a Western river system. Within 4 years, beaver activity on Bridge Creek had increased eightfold. The river's submerged area tripled. Side channels multiplied more than tenfold. Water temperatures dropped. The stream rose out of its trench, reconnecting with the floodplain for the first time in generations. And juvenile steelhead production increased by 175%, nearly 3 times more fish, surviving at rates 52% higher than in the untreated control watershed. The lesson of Bridge Creek is not that humans are powerless in the face of ecological collapse, nor that we can simply walk away from damaged landscapes and expect nature to fix itself.